Gracious and loving one, we give you thanks for the life, ministry, and generosity of this congregation. Be with us as we speak about our finances. Give us open minds, open hearts, and open hands ready to serve you. Make us good stewards of the resources we have been given for the advancement of your reign. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. So, our treasurer, unfortunately, is under the weather. And so you are stuck with your rector and some members of the finance committee that are here to talk about our parish finances. And luckily, Evelyn and I did this a bit together last year. And so I have a bit of a presentation. But I'm going to have a moment of honesty and vulnerability with you all, which is in October was the last time before the end of the year that the finance committee got a regular report from Sherry Bertram, who at the time was our business administrator. Sherry left us at the beginning of November. And in October, I really thought that we were going to finish the year very close to the deficit we had projected, which for 2025 was about $83,000. Yeah, about $83,000. Everything was kind of tracking so that the big months of November and December would start to absorb some of the deficit we'd built through the year. And I told the finance committee, I think we're on track for the budget we wrote. And then when we got the two finance reports at the end of the year, I was surprised that we had gotten to a $205,000 deficit. Now, there were two ways in which that surprised me. My last church did a slightly different kind of accounting. So all churches basically do, if you're an accounting nerd, something called modified cash, which is accountants speak for, they don't do it like anybody's supposed to do it, right? But because of the way that churches do business, the two kind of modes of accounting that most places go, either cash or accrual, neither one really corresponds to the way that churches, and especially Episcopal churches, according to our canons, are to run our finances. And so it means that there's a little bit of difference sometimes in how books are presented. At my last parish, anything that we could, that was an investment in our property, we used a capital fund for, and it happened outside of the operating budget. St. Michael's does that a little bit differently. We put all of the expenses through the operating budget, and then we allow our auditors to tell us what we can capitalize, and then we get a revised financial opinion several months into the year that tells us what our budget was minus the capital. So one thing you need to know is that about 40,000 and maybe up to 50,000 of this deficit is potentially going to be capitalized at the end, which means that a small part will come back into the budget as depreciation, but it'll still be a pretty significant deficit. The other drivers of the deficit are kind of two-part, and we'll get into that. But I wanted to give us some perspective, so I'm actually starting on my last slide. So in the year 2022, St. Michael's projected a deficit of $73,000 and realized a budget surplus of $200,000. We were in the black by $200,000. In 2023, the last year before I became rector, when the vestry prepared the budget before I got here, St. Michael's anticipated a budget deficit of $176,000 and realized a budget surplus of $9,000. In 2024, last year, the last year that JP was the primary driver to bring the draft budget to the finance committee, we projected a $183,000 deficit, and we came out balanced almost. We came back with a deficit of just $7,000, which was right about 1%, or less than 1% of the budget. This year, we projected 83,000, and we went to 205. Now, a big piece of that is capital, which is not budgeted. We don't budget for capital expenses. They land at the bottom of the spreadsheet without a budget. The other drivers of that we will get into. But if you look across a 5-year period, really a 4-year period, over the last 4 years, we've essentially now broken even. We are where we were in 2021 against our deficit. That's a little bit more complicated than that because St. Michael's is not just the church side, it's also the school side. And we are learning on the school side. The financial world on the school side has been changing so rapidly as the state has been taking on more and more of our expenses, which is great news. We actually now do not receive any private tuition at All Angels because the state has gone to universal childcare. The pre-K grants were the first start of this, but one of the things that has been true since we started receiving state money is that the state automatically pays us more than we were asking in private tuition by quite a bit. And so there's this whole other piece of the finances that is beyond our control and is right now helping to pad our bank balance. But that's another piece. So it's a very complex picture at St. Michael's. But I'm going to back us up to our first slide. So budget expenses versus actuals. So this is the budget expenses last year versus our budget for 2026. And if you have a device with you, I decided not to try to put like giant spreadsheets on this screen because even with a big screen, I figured most people wouldn't be able to see them. But you can see the view. I did put a block over the salaries partly because we'll be negotiating some salaries this year, and partly because I've heard in the past people don't love seeing everybody's salary on staff. So we blocked out the who makes what, and you can see the total for salaries on those spreadsheets. But you can see the total of what we budgeted and what we paid. We did pay just a little bit more than we budgeted, and most of that was because we negotiated 2 staff moving to Albuquerque, and we paid some moving allowances. But it was minor. Salaries is the biggest expenditure we have, and it was minor. The big increase in salaries from 2025 to 2026 is that we have 2 positions that were part of the year last year. Simone joined us in February, and Angel joined us in July, that will become full year salaries for 2026. There's one other driver, which is that, and this is, the budget right now is in draft form. Finance committee has forwarded it to the vestry, but the vestry meets today. The piece of the draft form budget that is not just a year over year, like growing to a full year, is that I think we need to expand the business administrator position to operate a little bit more like a COO. We had a huge boon at St. Michael's for a number of years in JP Arosa, who frankly was very undercompensated for the work that he was doing. But we found when Sherry was here that Sherry was very comfortable being a bookkeeper and giving us the monthly reports. But JP had a managerial hand in making sure our expenditures were being managed in a way that was just not in Sherry's. It was not the way the job was described to Sherry. And frankly, given her compensation rate, supervision was not in the picture for what we were paying her for. So I do think we need to increase the salary for the business administrator position and take it from 30 hours a week to 40 hours a week so that we have somebody who can help us keep control of all this. Frankly, even just the bookkeeping for Sherry was pushing on the edges a lot of that 30 hours a week. The complicated nature, especially of the school's bookkeeping to account for all of these grants, is a lot. But so that's the expense there. Benefits and taxes get more expensive when you have more time of people, and they get more expensive every year. Thankfully, our health insurance remained almost flat this year in the church. That has to do with a change that the General Convention of the Episcopal Church made because of the way that they were cost sharing around different plans. So we max out our plans that the employer will pay for at 80 plans. That means that it covers about 80% of health expenses. For a long time, churches that were offering the real Cadillac plan, it's called the 100 plans, that you don't have any deductibles at all. You may have a copay, and that's about it. Essentially, what the church figured out is they were subsidizing the very expensive plans by making everybody at every category pay more. And so the General Convention a couple years made a change so that those 100 plans are now subsidizing the lower plans and have really emphasized that 80 is the standard that they're asking folks to do, which is what St. Michael's has been doing for years. But it meant that we don't offer the 100 plans. If somebody was on a 100 plan, they would be paying the difference between a 180 plan. Their expense would get a lot more expensive this year, but the expense to the church for the 80 plans actually maintained. In a year when a lot of health insurance went up, because of that change, our health insurance was relatively flat. Otherwise, you can kind of see formation is about the only area. When different staff come, we tend to spend different lines differently. This year, Simone may have come from a place where she had to be really scrappy in formation spending, but we really didn't spend a lot on formation. The other thing that we did for the first time, and you'll see this if you're signing up for retreats, we're trying to ask people to contribute. For if you're coming to the retreat with Rudy and Nickens on the 7th, we're asking for a donation and we're asking for lunch. And that has helped offset some of the formation costs. We're still budgeting more because I have a really hard time. We'll see if it survives the vestry today, but I have a really hard time zeroing out children's ministry and youth ministry. And even if we didn't spend much money there, it's a hard thing for the rector to say we should cut this. Worship and music. It's a little tricky. The salaries for our section leaders, for the musicians that sing, are in this line rather than the salaries line because they're not salaries, they're paid per service. Last year, because Steve took a 3-month leave in the summer with the vestry's blessing, we actually saved a bit on Steve's salary, and then we had to pay some section leaders to help lead when in Steve's absence. So on total, it was actually a savings for the church that Steve made that decision, but it did mean we paid a little bit more. And so we're bringing that back down a bit, largely in the section leaders part. Outreach is sort of a tricky number. Last year, I put in for actuals everything that was in the food pantry, everything that we had in Indigenous ministry, all the Las Familias stuff. I've actually put that in a different line. But St. Michael's runs just a small part of what we do in outreach through our budget. It looks like it's a minuscule part of our budget, but you'll see later, we actually do tens of thousands of dollars worth of outreach. I do need to emphasize the only way that is possible is if there is an operating budget to make sure that there's accounting and the lights work and the trash gets taken out and all of those basic things that need to happen for us to have a food pantry and a Navajo ministry and all of those things. But outreach looks a lot smaller than it is. A lot of churches will also stick their diocesan pledge in their outreach, so it looks like they're paying a lot, like it's a huge part of their budget. We don't do that at St. Michael. Fellowship, if anybody gets an award for following their budget, it's Margie. The budget was $3,000 and they spent $2,985. The diocesan pledge, we pay a percentage of all of what we receive, and it's on a rolling, it's every month. We pay a percentage, it's about 12%, if I'm right. No, it's 18, it's even higher. 12 was my last diocese. So we pay a chunk of what we receive to the diocese every month. We have good news in that we have more pledges on hand, I think, than we've ever had at St. Michael's. In dollars, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of dollars. And it means that we will owe the diocese more. And then upkeep and insurance. You will see there is a big, we spent 202. We budgeted less than 118 last year. There are things we can capitalize and things we can't capitalize. We can capitalize things like when we pave the parking lot for $5,000 plus, when we put a new layer of tar down, that is something that adds to the value of the property. If we were to do a new HVAC system, that would be capital. Repairing the boilers does not count as a capital investment, which was a big chunk of the about $30,000 we had to spend in repairs at St. Michael's this year. Putting in a new water heater also didn't capitalize because even though it's an investment in the property, we have a policy that it has to be over a certain amount, and Lou put it in and the water heater cost $600, so it doesn't capitalize. It's viewed as a repair. But between $40,000 and $50,000 in capital spending and between $20,000 and $30,000 in repair, depending on what the auditors decide in the end counts as capital, we spent a lot more than we budgeted fixing up buildings. Solar, actually, Sherry did not run that through our capital. But we paid $168,000 for the panels. $60,000 of that is due back to us from the federal government. I am in the last stages of filling out those forms. I don't have a business administrator right now to fill out those forms. So I am being very, very, very careful and getting a lot of advice to make sure I fill out the right forms. Because it is not easy. The government did not publish here, if you're a church or a nonprofit, this is the form you fill out. They published this thing that makes it look like we built a power plant, and it's not easy. At 30% of the cost of those panels, they were installed by the deadline of December 31st and operational, and so we will get 30% of them back from the federal government, or we'll have to sue the federal government. But we are, under the law, we are due back about $60,000. But right now, that did hurt our cash balance. We had a check for $156,000 that we wrote in December that was cashed. And the good news is we still have over $200,000 just in our checking account, and we have Schwab. We've got good reserves. We are not in danger of not being able to pay our bills. But that's that piece is, it will affect our capital balance. All right, proposed budget revenue. So I had the opportunity, and I'm going to go back to this. This came out, and I got to sit with Finance Committee, and then I was kind of licking my wounds a little bit. Not from Finance Committee, but from feeling like this is tough. But it just so happened that I spent the last 3 days with the diocesan leadership. And so as soon as Finance Committee had finished with the reports, I forwarded them over to Canon J.P. Arosa, who used to have the gig of watching our finances and so has a lot of history, but who now is our diocesan canon for finance and administration. And so it's his job to deal with the rectors who are licking their wounds. And JP took a look. I sent him the stuff, and then we sat and had breakfast down in Roswell at the Fairfield by Marriott. And JP started by saying, "You know this isn't as bad as it looks, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You spent a lot on buildings that needed to have a lot spent on them. We'd been doing a lot of bubble gum and duct tape over the past few years. And it's actually like that you spent the money there is a good place to have spent it." He also said, "Mike, you're starting to realize these deficits that we were projecting before you got here." And a piece of that is, up until this year, and really since July of this year, St. Michael's has not been fully staffed. Most of these savings are because we had people depart our staff, and it took time to fill in the vacancy. But the vestry has not expanded the staffing that was in place since before I got here. So we have a structure right now that causes a deficit. It costs more money to employ the people we have than we're currently taking in. And there's two ways to approach that. We either need to reduce some headcount, or we need to find ways to produce the revenue that will support our staffing. And JP said, it's really important to look at this revenue piece because the actuals for 2025, we were in our budget a little too bullish on pledging. We didn't plug in the number of actual, we did the budget a little earlier last year, and so we're still receiving a lot of pledges. And so we plugged in 700,000, and in the end, I think we received 690 and change in pledging, which means we came close to it. We had a particular pledge that was delayed this year. We have actually already got the catch-up payment for last year in January. So you'll see in our budget, there's a $20,000 previous year pledges. And it also has a note that reminds me, don't count on this again. But so there was some of that, and there was some that we were bullish. We anticipated more pledging. But this year, with that $20,000, and $750,000 in pledging, we have really increased our pledge revenue. Our givers of record have been going down in recent years, and part of that is because your stewardship committee is doing their job really well. When somebody makes a pledge, their gifts move from there into pledging. And so we've reduced that this year. It had been at $60,000. I brought it down to 50, even though we only realized 40 this year, because the growth that I see, I think we still have a chance of making 50. Loose plate, we projected 17,000 and we got 17,841. And so I just left it in. Other income, we'd only budgeted at $3,000, and this year we got $12,000. That is things like holiday offerings. We were really intentional about asking for Christmas gifts this year, and you all were very generous. So that's a growing place in our budget. Facility use fees, we realized 6,000. We've got a couple more groups using the facility regularly. I think we can add a little bit there. This section of the budget, interest and dividend income, that was another driver that's important to understand. The Finance Committee made a decision toward the end of 2024 to move our, it was about $800,000 worth of reserves from a kind of mutual funds and stocks portfolio fully over into government bonds. We were nervous about what the economy was going to do. It seemed like a very conservative move in a time where there was a lot of unsteadiness. That had a big impact. We had received like $140,000 plus in growth and dividends from that portfolio. And the bonds got less, they paid less and less over the year. The rates went down, right? And so I think there is a question about our strategic reserve and how much risk we're willing to take with it in order to produce income. But I left $35,000 flat that had been in there. And then we haven't been, every year, one of the things that had saved our bacon in previous years had been that we account for the growth of the value at the end of the year. And so suddenly at the end of the year, we had like an extra $80,000 that had come in. And so I'm being a lot more conservative, dropping that down to $15,000, but we haven't been budgeting for it. And then the other piece to notice, a new place of revenue for us, Simone is shared. She's a full-time employee, but a quarter of her time is paid for by the diocese. And so the diocese now every month sends in a contribution toward her compensation. And so that, because of being a full year instead of 11 months and because of a cost of living increase, goes up this year. So that's the picture for revenue. Yes? Yeah, so givers of record versus pledge. Givers of record are people who we know who they are. They either write a check, and so we've got their name, or they put an envelope with cash into the plate. Or honestly, at this point, we have a number of people doing this online, but who are giving to the operating fund of the church, but have not made a pledge to the church. So as we get better and better at getting people to pledge, givers of record tends to go down as pledging goes up. And it's just because. But there are a handful of people that, for whatever reason, don't want to fill out a pledge card, but are going to give with some consistency. And so that's where that parks. So that's the givers of record piece. But this is the first cut we've made to that potential income. Alice?
So I have two questions. One is,
Yep.
Needed so much investment, and also I'm curious about why Simone is shared with the diocese.
Yeah, so let me do that in opposite order. Simone is shared with the diocese because when we were interviewing candidates for that position, she was the most qualified person who we interviewed and talked with, and there was a real desire to hire her. She, at the time, was the rector of the Episcopal Church in Alamogordo and had already agreed with the diocese to be the dean of the bishop's school. The bishop's school dean was retiring. That had already been negotiated. And then Canon Lee at the time said, Mike, it might make sense for Simone to actually transition back to Albuquerque. She's maybe interested in another job. Would you be interested in interviewing Simone? And I said, sure. And it was part of the idea the whole time that if Simone came to St. Michael's, that she and the diocese would still like her to be in the bishop's school. We interviewed a handful of candidates. There's a significant clergy shortage right now, and so we didn't have like 30 candidates for the job. Simone was the best candidate we had, and this was kind of part of the deal before we even interviewed her. So it's a long-term plan, yeah. Unless she decides she doesn't want to be the dean of the bishop's school, it's a long-term funded part of her ministry and of the diocesan ministry. And the other side, the things that need, the tour next week is important, get a chance to take a look at it. But it was, and there's more this year. Everything from like, we need to remud the parapets on these buildings, to we've got roofs that are coming to the end of their life. But one of the principal drivers was to get the heat to turn on last year. We had to do some really significant investigative and then boiler repair work, and those bills hit in January. But we did that. The one we're still trying to figure out what goes in repair and what goes in capital. We've put quite a bit of money into what was the youth building to transition that to be the landing. And so we've been adding a shower back into that bathroom so that can be a space, so that we can free up space in the church offices, and that can be a homier space. The groups that are using it now need dorm rooms a little bit less with bunk beds. We're getting people kind of 1 and 2 at a time. And so the need was identified, and that building was really underutilized. And so it's only to the tune of about $8,000, but that's a piece. $1,000 expense, which we just absolutely had to do. I don't know if you remember the old dead cottonwood that was in front of the lot there, the empty lot we have between our parking lots. But we found out that it was dead and needed to come down, and it seemed like a wise idea to take that down before it took out a car on Montano, and so we took that down. And then the other 2 pieces that are in there, we have paid 50% on a new sign for the church. We don't have a sign that's visible from Montano, and the sign we have is in significant disrepair. So the property committee's actually been working on that for a number of years, and we finally found a company and have a design. So that was about $17,000. There'll be another 50% due this year. And then the architects. It was pretty early in the year when we started, and pretty early in my time as rector actually, when I started looking at all of the various projects and plans and how much there is to do on this campus, that I said, we need a plan for this. We can't just have a giant spreadsheet and be hitting either the lowest hanging fruit or the most necessary thing, because we're going to get walloped. And it's something like our boilers are at the end of their life cycle, and if we don't do something about them proactively, we will replace them to the tune of $60,000 to $80,000. If we get in a proactive stance with it, we can have a conversation about converting the church over to a heat pump. Now that we're on solar energy, we built the solar with an extra percentage of generation in there, so we could turn our heat production over to electricity. If we do a heat pump on the grid, it's actually pretty expensive. It's an expensive way to produce energy, but if you're doing it with solar, it's free. And if we went to a heat pump, the heat pump includes air conditioning. So yeah. So that's the kind of decision that by doing planning, we can do. And one of the first questions we asked the architect was, help us think about some of these old facilities that were not built for the purposes we're using them. Whether renovating them or replacing them is the more economical decision. Spoiler alert for next Sunday, it looks like replacing them may be a better economic decision. Because of the way they were constructed, it's really hard to MacGyver them much further than we already have. So, but that, by doing it in a plan that lets us take it in chunks over a number of years, we can address the kind of highest needs, and we can plan for it rather than just having it happen to us as kind of happened this year. Katie.
What are some of the things that you think are most important to consider when you're thinking about the future of the church? And what are some of the things that you think are most important to consider when you're thinking about the future of the church?
We don't have, we decided not to go forward with bids for that until we went through a whole plan with the architect. And part of that was to do an assessment of what the highest needs really were. And part of that is we've actually had a couple of difficulties with getting contractors. I think everybody's having difficulties getting contractors. But particularly when we were looking for electricians for the youth building conversion to the landing, we heard from another number of electricians that they didn't like working with St. Michael's because we would ask them for bids and then not do the work. And so we've gotten a lot more conservative about when we actually ask for bids, because we don't want to have a reputation as an institution that solicits bids and then doesn't do anything. So there were bids solicited for that a number of years ago, and it was a six-figure. It was like 100 something. At that time, I'm sure it's significantly more now, given the space, but that is, we won't do that until we kind of have a plan and the architect says, this is the time to do that. So right now it's capital, it's in the capital line, so it's part of the $40,000 that's in there. I think there's about $8,000 that's in the repair that will end up in the capital if we're able to put the whole project together for the landing. But I don't know in the end if the auditors will be convinced that the trees were part of capital investment. That was Sherry's call, and we will see. And JP was sort of 50-50 on whether we'd be able to count the architects or not, depending on how quickly we move toward constructing something. What? He was like, I don't know what your auditors will say. Our past auditors probably wouldn't, but who knows what the next ones will. So this is where we get into it. Sometimes finance committee members have opinions that the auditors don't have, and at the end we pay the auditors. So this is one where I go, I have a theology degree, so I don't know. I know that I need a business administrator who has this background, because right now it's kind of me in finance, and that's tricky. Greg. No, the way that we get the money from the state, well, up until recently, the way that we got the money from the state was through the pre-K grants. And so we were reimbursed for actual expenses. So there's no, I mean, there's not they look at our receipts and give us a check after we've spent the money. On the other, now that and it's tricky because it's all coming through in the same department. And so there's pre-K grants and ECD money, but pre-K is also coming from ECD, but that's pre-K. The child care money is based on head count. And so the only way that they would want to come back is if they doubted our head count, like how many kids we were paying for. And it's the kind of thing where the state, so the school board, with the blessing of the vestry, increased the salaries at the school in December. And that was because the new early child care money has a caveat in it that if you are paying a minimum wage of $19 an hour, you can actually get more money per student. And the difference was more than it was going to cost us to raise those salaries. And so it's an interesting thing because it sometimes feels like we're not the drivers anymore on certain financial decisions. But that's the kind of decision, like, why would we not do that? But it's not something where it's like we're looking at various proposals and the vestry is making a decision on it. What we had to do, though, is say those raises are contingent. The current, like, universal child care that the governor set up is not legislative yet. The legislature is considering that in its budget this session. So we had to make it contingent on it becoming the law of the state of New Mexico that we have this money long term and that they structure it similarly. But it is sort of, we're sort of at the, I don't want to say mercy. It'd be really great, though, if you wanted to reach out to your legislators and tell them to continue that funding. Because I think there's a real possibility, you will see if you look at the detail of our budget, because more and more of the school's funding comes from the state, We are working on the school sharing the actual cost of the administration and of the operation of the facility. And so 2 years ago, the school only contributed $12,000 a year to the administration budget, and they were using more than 50% of our business administrators' time in terms of bookkeeping. So it is now up to $36,000, and I don't know that that's the ceiling because that's still well below fair market rental rate for the space that school is in. But when we were charging it to people who were paying private tuition, and families were the kind of families we often had at All Angels were really struggling to make ends meet, the church really subsidized the school. We're now in a situation where I don't really want to subsidize the state of New Mexico any more than I already am by paying my taxes. So we're in a situation where the school, as it has more income from the state, the school board and the vestry and the finance committee will be working to figure out, are we going to share more of that business admin's salary with the school? If that continues to leave us room, we may start putting money into the capital fund, because some of the building that needs the most attention is the school building. And so we'll have to be judicious and make sure that the money is only going to things that it should be going for the operation of the school. But the church has been really subsidizing the school. And now that the state of New Mexico is paying for it, we got to keep working to adjust that relationship. Lee. Yeah, so the architect's name is Paul Baribeau from, is it Groth Architects? What? I want to say it's Groth. It's a firm from Wisconsin. It's the same firm that St. Mark's is using on their renovation. With the team interviewed a whole series of architects, including local architects, and ended up choosing this architect from competitive bids.
Food pantry fit into all this? Do they have their own?
Yeah, the food pantry. So part of the food pantry is that because the food pantry is volunteer run, and because the administration of the church covers the administration of the food pantry, every dollar that we receive right now to the food pantry buys food, right? And we had $60,000 almost, if you round up. We had $60,000 worth of contributions to the food pantry this year. So that's amazing. And they spent 30 of it. We run a for-profit food pantry. But all that money gets held in reserve and is spent on food and other items needed. I tried to spend money a couple weeks ago on maxi pads, and then an OBGYN in the congregation got word that we were buying subpar maxi pads and instead donated really high quality ones. And there may be a small movement afoot to get a group of people who know what good maxi pads are to be the ones who provide those for the food pantry. Well, the electricity was part of the church budget, and now the church will pay the $15 a month it costs to have the meter. So the way that we did the solar panels, partly because of something Jack Knight brought up at Finance Committee. When the church purchased the property, the Casa San Miguel that is now the food pantry, the original idea was to tear it down and to build a purpose-fitted food pantry. Why would we put a bunch of money into putting solar panels on the roof that couldn't be moved? And the answer was, well, we can put solar panels on the roof that can be moved. So all of the solar that we have relies on something called a microinverter, and it's not even screwed into the roof. It's on these brackets with heavy cinder block weights. So we could move the panels that are currently on the food pantry onto a new building. But we put panels. We have 4 meters, and we put panels on each meter that more than cover what that meter is. And it's like the most meters are on the church building, and then over on the parish hall school, that's 1 meter. And there's a little bit on the food pantry. And the way that all balances out is that we should more than cover each meter. But there's additional capacity built in to the church and parish hall so that if we do switch over to heat pumps, we should still mostly cover that and pay. And if we had to add a panel or two, we can daisy chain them in because of the microinverters. We put every panel on that we wanted to. That was a bit of a rush job in the sense that we considered bid, we did all that, but we moved that fast because we had a sense that the government subsidies might expire and we ought to take advantage of it. And I'm really glad we did that because that $60,000 was almost a third of the cost of the panels. Jack.
Is it time or do more work to get alternative funding, i.e. foundation, people to write grants? As our outreach programs grow, surely there are alternate.
So I'm really glad you're a member of the Finance Committee asking that question. As I've looked at this budget, and I've said it a lot of times, I think Finance Committee largely agrees with me. JP and I talked about it and he agrees with me. We don't have an expenditure problem at this time, and we've got a revenue problem. Our expenditure problem will come up if we don't start seeing, I don't want to say start seeing, because there's in this year over year, where'd it go? It's this one. We've had a lot of increasing generosity, and I just want to notice that. There's $130,000 of new revenue in the budget for 26. And we're behind the curve, but we've been projecting to be behind the curve for a while. But I do think that it is time to look at more revenue sources. We're really grateful that we have 47 new pledges. The mode, by far, so the most common of those pledges, is $1,200, which tells me that we've got a lot of people that are being generous, but have some capacity for potentially being asked. The folks that do fundraising in churches tell me that there's a really important difference in how generations think about generosity. And as our generations shift in the church, I'm going to let Simone start and I will head over there when it's time. We need to start thinking about year-round talking about our operating budget and even finding ways. So we've talked both at Finance and at Stewardship about doing a special fundraiser this year, like we did last year when we had over $82,000 donated to solar panels, but targeting it especially to outreach and formation and saying, to keep doing what we've been doing, we need to create more revenue here. Part of what we learned doing the solar panels was that of those 47 pledgers, a decent number of them, the first time they gave to St. Michael's was for solar panels. And then the Stewardship Committee could call and invite them to give to the operating budget and make a pledge. But as we have new folks in it, it takes a while for folks to get to the place where they understand that we really ask people to make their primary giving through their pledge to the operating budget, because that's what enables all our ministry. And then, I do think there's some room. I was told recently by somebody from the foundation that we're the largest food pantry in Albuquerque that doesn't have a Ford grant. And so I'd like to look at that and what's possible there. And I think there are some potential outside, even our community sources. The food pantry this year did attract donations from folks who are not going to ever become pledgers, some of whom are pledgers at other Episcopal churches and other churches around town, particularly when the SNAP benefits were challenged. That was a piece. But I think we've got a revenue question more than an expenditures question. Yep. They're completely paid for, and that means that there is a deficit right now in our capital fund that then will get replenished when we get our check from the government. Yeah, it was about $16,000 a year that is now, we had to put $600 in that line because you do have to pay for the privilege of having a meter, and we have 4. But our solar won't work without the meters. And trying to condense them all down to 1 meter was something that an architect would have to do. Doing it quickly wasn't going to happen. But yes, the answer is we've basically zeroed out the solar. We do, the church's reserves ended up paying for $20,000 of those, but that is about a year and a quarter of the electricity that we were paying. So we did really well on that.
So can people still make donations?
You're more than welcome to donate to the solar panels until we reach $104,000. So we got about $22,000 that we could still receive in donations for solar panels. I am still waiting. I'm really hoping to throw holy water at them as one of the stops on the way. The last I heard, Some of them were operational, but the big set of panels, when P&M came to turn them on, they went and looked and they said, oop, it was wired backwards. And so then the folks came and then P&M had to come back again.
But they're on now.
I think they're on now, but I haven't seen the thing in my phone yet. So, but I'm hoping this week. It's been week by week with that. They're all installed and operational based on the federal government's need, but then you have to do this dance with P&M to actually be licensed to turn them on. Other questions? We're not panicking. We have room to grow, and while the deficit is higher than I'd like it to be, and we'll see when the vestry finishes with it today, but I think there's a real possibility that over the next 5 years, we will get to the place where we have intentionally spent some reserves to grow our programming and gotten ourselves to a really sustainable plan with our buildings, so that we are growing as a congregation and supporting really important ministries. And the big takeaway here is, I mean, in addition to all that pledging, I mean, look at how much you all gave to the food pantry, to the solar panels, to Las Familias, to Navajo Land. And so, like, this is an incredibly generous congregation, and it's going to take us a while to get moving pieces ironed out. And if you are really, you'll see this in your Rector's Warden report, but if you're really engaged in these questions, we would encourage you to speak with your vestry members and talk with them about ways you can be part of the nuts and bolts support of this congregation, whether that's through Finance Committee, Stewardship Committee, or the other groups, Property Committee, the other groups that make the kind of decisions that keep us going in the long term. Yeah.
Destroy, rebuild, it's a new mortgage, right?
Depends on how we do it. I mean, so financing could be part of how we do that work, but depending on the generosity and the capacity within the congregation, capital giving tends to be separate from operating giving. So it's a new ball of wax, and the facilities that we have are at the end of their usable life. And so we are either going to be paying money toward new facilities, or we're going to be paying money to try to keep together facilities that are in decline. So you kind of, it's that thing that everybody has to do when they're deciding, do I get a new car yet or not, right? Am I going to spend more repairing the car I currently have? Or, I mean, buildings are different, but it's a similar financial thing in your. Other questions? All right, I got to go celebrate the Eucharist. Thank you all so much.